All right, Chavre, with Hashem's help, we're learning today Yevamos Daf Tez Zayin. We left off Daf Tez Zayin Amud Aleph all the way on top, the top line of the Amud Tashema. We are discussing the machlokes between a Shlokish and Rabbi Avraham, whether Beis Shammai lo yasu, Beis Shammai did not follow their own rulings, or if Beis Shammai asu, they followed their rulings. Their followers followed their rulings. And nevertheless, there was no issue, not with Leish's Goydadu, as we explained before, because it wasn't in the same Beis Din or in the same city. There was no Roiv issue, because even though that the majority were on the school of Beis Hillel, but the Beis Shammai was Mechadadi Tfei, they were sharper, nor do we have the concept of a Baskoil, even though the Baskoil said, Halacha ki Beis Hillel, nevertheless, we have the concept of Rabbi Yehoshua, that Ein Mashgichin beBaskoil, Torah is not in the heavens, v'chulei. So Tashema, this is the final proof. B'mei Rabbi Doise ben Horkinas, that during the life of Rabbi Doise ben Horkinas, and as we'll see soon, that Rabbi Doise had a brother that followed the rulings of Beis Shammai, and they mistakenly thought it was Rabbi Doise himself. Rabbi Doise was the great of the generation. Chutrat Soras Habas La'achim. They allowed once for the co-wife of an erva to marry the brother in Yibum. In other words, the halacha of Beis Shammai was practiced. So Shema Mino, that it was actually asu ve'asu, and that's the end of that. Shema Mino. Now the Gemara is going to analyze this story itself. Gufa, we learned the Mei Rabbi Doise ben Horkinas, that during the life of Rabbi Doise ben Horkinas Chutru or Heitiru Tzaras Abbas La'achim, they allowed the co-wife of an erva marry a brother with Yibum. In other words, they practiced the halacha of Beis Shammai. Says the Gemara, it was very difficult for the sages of that time to accept that. Why? Because this Rabbi Doise was a great Chacham. And therefore, when someone like him follows the ruling of Beis Shammai, it gives the ruling of Beis Shammai tremendous credibility. But they were troubled by that. Now, what does one normally do when you're troubled with something? You bring it up in discussion. The challenge they had with Rabbi Doise, says the Gemara, that ve'enov kamu milavayla beis medrash, his eyes stopped, his eyes became dimmed. If he was fully blind or if he was partially blind, he couldn't see properly, and therefore he stopped coming to the Beis HaMedrash because he couldn't see. So the Chachamim didn't have the chance of having this discussion with him. How can you paskin like Beis Shammai? And until it bothered them to the point that they felt they need to bring it up to him. So Amar, they said, or the other gears on the side is Amru, they discussed amongst themselves, Mi Yelech, who will go to him? V'yoidiu, and will notify him that it's bothering us that he paskin like Beis Shammai. Amalahem Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua was the elders in that time in the Beis HaMedrash. He also was the one that personally knew Rabbi Doise. So Rabbi Yeshua felt, Ani Elech, I will go and have this discussion with him. The Chachamim there felt that one is not enough. So they asked, Ve'achrav mi, who else will go along with him? So who decided to join in was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Ve'achrav mi, Rabbi Akiva. Interestingly, right, we all learned together in Masechtas Brachas the whole story about how Rabbi Gamliel was demoted from being the Nasi, how Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was put in his place, and these are the same characters. These are the same chevra. So it was Rabbi Yeshua, right? He was the one that he didn't get offended, but the people felt that Rabbi Gamliel offended him. And then you had Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and you had Rabbi Akiva. So Holchu va'amdu al Pesach Beisai. They went and they congregated on the door to his house. Some of the Achronim point out that the concept that they went and they gathered outside the door of his house implied that they arrived there together, but they didn't walk together. And they felt that if these three Chachamim would have walked together to go have this discussion with Rabbi Doise, it would have drawn everyone's attention. Wow, did you see that both Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva, where were they going? And ultimately people would find out they were going to Rabbi Doise. Why were they going to Rabbi Doise? Something happened. They didn't want this to become an issue. They didn't want people to start speaking, Rabbi Doisa said Kebei Shammai, and they feel Kebei Hillel, and it's going to be right to Machloikis. So they went there, each one separately, but they, and they gathered together. And Nichnas Shiv Chasei, Rabbi Doisa's maidservant, notified him. Amrullah, she noticed that people, these great Chachamim, are about to enter. Rebbe Chachma Yisrael Boy Metzlecha. Rabbi Doisa, Rebbe, the greatest of the sages, came to greet you. Amar Lo Yikonsu. So he tells his Shivcha, go ahead, tell them to enter. Then Nichnasu, and they entered. So now, Tefasei Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Doisa grabbed Rabbi Yeshua. From here you see that he knew Rabbi Yeshua. And V'hoishivu al mita shalzav. I think we got to straighten it out because you got it off. V'hoishivu al mita shalzav, and Rabbi Doisa asked Rabbi Yeshua, come sit with me on my golden bed. Omar Lein. So Rabbi Yoshua tells Rabbi Doisi, Rebbe, my master Rabbi Doisa, I'm not here by myself. You see, Rabbi Doisa was blind. Tell your other student like you greeted me and tell him to sit down. Omar Loi, so Rabbi Doisa asked Rabbi Yehoshua, Mihu, who was my other Talmud that entered with you? So he responded, Rabbi Elazar ben Azari. Omar, so he responded, V'yeshle ben la Azariah chaverenu? Wow, does my friend Azariah have a son? Rebbe, he was very happy. He knew the great Azariah. And he knew he was a great tzaddik. And he was very happy that his son, Rabbi Elazar, is now the great Rabbi Elazar ben Azari. So, Kara Olav Mikra Hazeh, and then he said the verse, he read the pasuk, Nar ho'isi v'gam zokanti, that I was once young, and I got old, v'loi re'isi tzaddik nezov, v'zari mevakesh lachem. And I never saw a tzaddik abandoned, forsaken, and his son needing to seek out bread. Evidently, Azariah was very wealthy, and he understood that this Rabbi Elazar also was very wealthy. So he was thanking God that someone who was a tzaddik was given the gift of maintaining the wealth for the next generation. And again, Tefasai, just like he grabbed Rabbi Yoshua, he grabbed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, v'hoishivu al mito shalzav, and he sat him down on a golden bed. Amalei, so Vaite Rabbi Yeshua tells Rabbi Doisi ben Horkinas, Rebbe, Emor l'talmidcha acher v'yeshev. Rebbe, you have another student that's here, ask him to sit down. Amalei, so Rabbi Doisi asked Rabbi Yeshua, Umihu, who is this third who came with you? So he answered, Akiva ben Yosef. So Amar Lei, so Rabbi Doisa tells Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Doisa tells Rabbi Akiva, Atu hu Akiva ben Yosef. Are you the famous Akiva ben Yosef? Sheshimcha ha'elach misoif ha'elam atsoifai, that your fame, your name is spread out from one end to the world to the other. Shave b'ni shave, sit my son, sit. Point out a couple of interesting things. When it came to the other two Chachamim, he didn't say the word shave b'ni shave. It says that he grabbed them and he sat them on a golden bed. So what's with Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef? So there's many responses to it. One of them is that the table or the bed that Rabbi Doisa was sitting on only had room for two more people. And when he wanted first Rabbi Yeshua to sit on his bench, on his golden bed, Rabbi Yeshua found it to be disrespectful. So he needed to physically chop him and sit him down. Likewise with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. But now that there was no room on the bench, so he wants that Rabbi Akiva should sit down. Rabbi Akiva wasn't being asked to sit down on his golden table, to sit down on a bench. So you didn't have to grab him to sit down. Why would he not sit down? The Ragachover says that we have 7 times throughout the whole Shas the words Shev b'ni Shev. And he points out with the play of words that Shev means to sit down, and Shev means 7. So in any event, everyone is sitting down. And after Rabbi Akiva sits down, he tells Rabbi Akiva, Kamoischa yirbu b'Yisrael, may there be many more like you amongst the Jewish people. All right. They started besieging him with halachas, meaning they came there to address how can you, Rabbi Doisa, rule like Beis Shammai? But they didn't right away ask him that question. Either it's considered disrespectful, or because he might get defensive. So the right way of dealing with these issues are, they began speaking about one halacha, about another halacha, about a third halacha. They got into a comfortable conversation until they came to the discussion regarding the co-wife of an erva, and Amru Lei, and they asked Rabbi Doisa, Tzaras Habas Mahu? What is the halacha regarding the co-wife of an erva? In other words, do you not need yibum nor chalitza, or do you have to do yibum nor chalitza? Amar Lohem, so Rabbi Doisa tells him, you're asking me that question? Machlekes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. It's an argument. So they asked him, halacha kedivrei mi? Like whom is the halacha? Amar Lohem, so Rabbi Doisa ben Horikina says, what do you mean like who is the halacha? Halacha is like Beis Hillel. Amru Lei, so they tell Rabbi Doisa, haloi mishimcha amru, but we heard them saying in your name that you say halacha ki Beis Shammai. So Amar Lohem, so he responded to that, Doisa shamatem? Did you hear my name being quoted that Rabbi Doisa said? Oy ben Horkinas shamatem? Or did you hear that the son of Horkinas said the halacha is like Beis Shammai? Why? What difference would there be? Obviously he wasn't the only son. So Amrulei, so when they heard that question being asked, they realized that indeed they never heard it in the name of Rabbi Doisa. They heard it in the name of Ben Horkinas. So they said, Chaye Rebbe, by your life, you're right. Stam Shamanu. We heard Stam, the son of Horkinas, said. We were the ones that wrongfully associated and said, it must have been you. It was not you. So Amar Lohem, so now Rabbi Doisa explained to them that Ach Koten Yeshli, I have a younger brother. Now he used words now that are very difficult to understand. He called his small brother B'choir Satanhu. He is the firstborn of the Satan. Wow. So I guess first of all there's a girsa that says that he said B'choir Shanun, that he is a very sharp B'choir. But if he meant Satan, the meaning of Satan means that he's very sharp and very stubborn. The Satan is sharp, he outwits all of us. And the Satan is very stubborn because he keeps on going at it. In the few areas that we have the koyach to stand up to the Satan, he doesn't give up on trying to make us do the wrong. You know, whether he meant it in a derogatory way, whether he meant it b'choir shananhu, he says, I have a brother, and his name is Yonasan. And you should know who mitalmidei Shammai, and he is from the students of Shammai, which is why he was the one that said that a bechor erva has to do yibum or chalitza. And by the way, he tells them, before you think that you're going to go and have the discussion you wanted to have with me, you're going to have it with him, don't do that. You will lose the debate. He's sharper than all of you. V'yizoharu, beware, shelo yikapeach eschem b'halachos. He won't confuse you in halachis. He won't overwhelm you with halachis. And you should know, particularly when it comes to this law, he has 300 proofs regarding the conversation, regarding the sugya of Tzaras Habas, that he holds that the co-wife of an erva is allowed to do yibum, and therefore has to do yibum or chalitza. He will win over you. Now 1 second. If Yonasan ben Horkinas had 300 proofs that Shammai is right, so why isn't Shammai right? And here you see something that how important Mesoida, how important tradition is for us. That once we have a tradition that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, once we know this is the truth, even if we are unable to logically substantiate that tradition, we accept the tradition. Now if there would have been someone smarter than Yonasan, that someone smarter would have won Yonasan in a debate. But not every time a person loses a debate doesn't mean that they're wrong, especially when it comes to tradition. On the other hand, he didn't want for the Chachamim to enter debate because Rabbi Doisa felt that if Rabbi Akiva, if Rabbi Yeshua, if Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, if they will have this conversation and they will feel convinced by Yonasan that Yonasan is right, that Beis Shammai is right, they will rule halacha ke Beis Shammai. Because you have to do that, because these are the big Chachamim, and you don't rule by prophecy, you rule by your understanding. So he told them, don't debate with him. And how do I know that I'm right? I call for witnesses, the heavens and the earth, that on this mortar, the golden chair now is being called Stam Hapsa mortar, that on the chair that I'm sitting, Yoshav Chagai Hanavi, that Chagai, the prophet, who lived many years before Rabbi Doisa ben Kinas, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, they lived during the times of the Churban. The second Bai stood for 420 years. Chagai would live during the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. And even though we find people in the times of Nach that lived hundreds of years, not Chagai. So it wasn't that Chagai was someone who communicated directly to Rabbi Doisa, but Rabbi Doisa says that I heard from him. In other words, I heard from someone, from my teacher, or heard from his teacher, that I heard from Chagai. And V'Amar and Chagai said, Shloisha Devarim. He said the following 3 rules. The first rule that Chagai said was Tsaras, Habas, Asura. Chagai said what Beis Hillel said later. Chagai said what the halacha is today, that the co-wife of an erva is not allowed to do yibum. And therefore there's no need for her to do chalitza because she herself becomes a erva. Having a relation with her is prohibited under the penalty of kodesh. So number one, since Chagai said that has to be the halacha. So don't debate my brother. The second halacha was Amoin Umayav Ma'asrin Ma'aser Oni Bashvi'is. This means the following. A couple of intros. Intro number 1. When the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu conquered the lands that are Me'ever LaYarden, including the lands that we call the lands of Amoin and Moav. Yeshua then went ahead and conquered Israel, and throughout the following hundreds of years, and it concluded under the leadership of David HaMelech, the Yidden, the Jewish people, conquered all of the 7 nations, plus we had the lands that Moshe Rabbeinu conquered. Whatever was conquered by the Jewish people got the status of the Holy Land, upon which you have many mitzvahs, including all of the mitzvahs of agriculture, Ma'aser Rishon, Truma, Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Sheni, Ma'aser Ani, and including the prohibition of not working the land on the Shemitah year. During the Shemitah year, being that we're not allowed to work the land, there are no mitzvahs of tithings. Nothing. Not Truma, not Ma'aser Rishon, not Ma'aser Sheni. All produce is more or less ownerless, and everyone and anyone can take what they need for that meal. You can't hoard produce, but everyone can take whatever they need. Then, when we were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, we left Israel, as the Gemara is going to say later, and as we will learn many times together, that the Gemara is of the opinion that Kedusha Rishayna, that the first sanctification of the land of Israel, Kitcha L'Shata, was sanctified then, for that time, but V'loi Kitcha L'Asad Lavai. But the original sanctification was not something that lasted forever. In other words, when we were exiled, the Holy Land was divested from its holiness. It wasn't as holy as. When we entered again under the leadership of Ezra, from Golus Bavel, we conquered, or we settled in many areas in Israel. Those areas regained their holiness. All of the mitzvahs that are connected to the land of Israel were re-implemented in those areas, but we did not resettle all of the areas that we used to live during the times of the first Beis Hamikdash, including we didn't resettle the lands of Ammon and Moav. And therefore Ammon and Moav did not have the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore Shemitah year did not need to be kept. Now, by rabbinic law, all of the lands that were adjacent to or very near Israel were lands that were given the obligation to tithe, trumas, umaiser, all the maisers, midirabanan. Not only Ammon and Moav, Syria, Egypt, the lands around Israel where Jewish people lived, even though they were not holy lands, by rabbinic law, you needed to give the tithings. But being that you didn't have to keep Shemitah year, the Chachamim told us that we also have to tithe during the Shemitah year. Make sense? You're not mechuyev to rest the land. We did not leave the land fallow, so tithe. The question is very simple. During the 7-year cycle, during the 6-year cycle of giving Trumas Umaisres, we didn't give exactly the same tithing year in, year out. It was a cycle. The first year, the second year, you gave Truma, first Meiser, second Meiser. During the 3rd year, you gave the Meiser, the second Meiser was for the poor. there was no Meiser Sheni, there was only Meiser Ani. The 4th and the 5th, Meiser Ish and Meiser Sheni. The 6th year, Meiser Ish and Meiser Ani. So now the question was, if you have to give tithing during the Shemitah year in the lands of Ammon and Moav, what tithing should you give on the 7th year? During the first 6 years, we never had 2 consecutive years where we gave Meiser to the poor. We had 2 consecutive years where you give Meiser Sheni, the 1st year and the 2nd year, the 4th year and the 5th year. Meiser Ani was only for 1 year. And being that on the 6th year you give Meiser Ani, logic would have dictated that on the 7th year, you should go back to Meiser Sheni. Came along Chagai, came along Rabbi quoting the name of Shammai, that wherever you needed to give tithing midrabanan, and Chagai, correct, wherever you have to keep the mitzvah of tithing, even though it's only midrabanan, on the 7th year, the tithing is Meiser Ani. And what is the third halacha? The third halacha is Mekablin Gedim Min HaKarduyim Umin HaTarmoidim. There were 2 nations. One of them were called the Karduyim. The other one are called the Tarmoidim. And Chagai said that you could allow people from those nations to convert to become Jewish. Why would you not allow to? What was the Chiddush? So Rashi is going to say over here, and we're going to learn this in next Amid, and we'll learn this later in Masechtas Ksubas, that there were those opinions that held that if a non-Jew had a relation with a Jewish woman and had an offspring, or if a slave had a relation with a Jewish woman and had an offspring, the child is called a mamzer. There was, as we'll learn later as well, that there were those opinions that held that if a Jewish man had a relation with a non-Jewish woman, the child is considered Jewish, but is considered a mamzer. No, we don't paskin that way, but you have these opinions in the Gemara. Now, if they are considered Jewish mamzerim, who don't even know that they're Jewish, what's the downside of accepting them as converts? The upside is obvious. If they're Jewish anyway, they have to keep the mitzvahs anyway. Good. If someone will convert, conversion means they're accepting upon themselves to keep the commandments. So a Jew, they don't know that they're Jewish. So the Jew will keep a mitzvah. But the problem is, since that they were really Jewish anyway, but they are mamzerim, if you're going to accept them as converts, they're going to marry into the Jewish people, you don't want to add to mamzerim amongst the Jewish people. So there was a reason to think that you're not allowed to accept converts. Came along Chagai, and he says that we do accept converts because they are not Jews there. They're just non-Jews. So a non-Jew becomes a Jew. Tana, we learned that when the 3 Chachamim entered Rabdoisa Nichnasu a Pesach Echad, they entered his house going in one door. But when they walked out, Yatsu b'shloisha psachim. Each one left in a different direction. Look inside the second Tosfos. Why did they leave through different doors? Tosfos gives 2 opinions. Mamish min hakatza el hakatza. From one extreme to the other. The first thing Tosfos says, that being that Rabbi Doisa warned them, don't meet my brother Yonasan, they didn't want to meet him. So they didn't want to go together because, again, when these 3 people walk together, it becomes right away the talk of the town. Did you see those great sages walking together? And maybe Yonasan will hear about it and he's going to go over to them. The other Inami Tosfos says the opposite. That now that Rabbi Doisa told him, don't enter into debate with my brother, they dafke wanted to enter in debate with him. So each one left through a separate door, hoping that if I won't meet him, you'll meet him. And Pagabai bet Rabbi Akiva. And indeed, Rabbi Akiva met him. Okay. So actually, Yonasan asked or brought his proofs to Rabbi Akiva, and V'oikmei. And he substantiated his opinion. In other words, Rabbi Akiva did not have how to respond to Yonasan. It came out that Yonasan was right, that Shammai is right, that Beis Shammai is right, that Soras Habas is not an erva. You have to do Yibum. So after Yonasan won the debate, Yonasan got disappointed in Rabbi Akiva. So Yonasan ben Horkinas told Rabbi Akiva, Atuhu Akiva, are you the Akiva that your fame goes from one end of the world to the other? You're so lucky to have such a good name, but you don't really deserve it. You don't even qualify to be a cattle herder. So Amar Loi, Rabbi Akiva tells him, I'm not qualified to be a cattle herder. I'm not even qualified to be a sheep herder. A royet tzayin, a shepherd of sheep, was on a lower social status, on a lower social level than a cattle herder. And the reason for that was because, as we learned, that there was a takan of the Chachamim not to raise small animals in habitated places in Israel, because small animals end up grazing from other people's property, unlike larger animals that can be better muzzled, and therefore you will never violate theft. If you own a lot of small domesticated animals, they will end up stealing from other people. And the shepherd is part guilty in this theft. He can't control all those sheep from eating up the neighbor's grass. So Rabbi Akiva very humbly says, you're right. Now the Gemara says, and that's the end of this. Now the Gemara wants to analyze those three dinim. Is this law that Rab Doisa repeated from Chagai Hanavi, that you give Ma'aser Ani in the 7th year in the lands upon which you needed to give tithing? In other words, lands that were not re-sanctified, because we learned that that there were many cities that were conquered by those Jews who entered Israel the first time. They were called the Oil Mitzrayim. But they were not reconquered or not resettled by the Jews who returned to Israel after the first Galus of Bavel. And the Kedusha Rishayna, the first sanctification, was only Kitchel Shaita, was only a temporary sanctification, but it wasn't an eternal sanctification. And I once heard a good word. Why was that? Because there are two ways to invest holiness in the land of Israel. One is called through kibush, through conquering a land. When you conquer something in a war, it's called kinyan kibush. And there's another type of kinyan called kinyan chazaka. When you settle in a place, not because you conquered it, when you live in a place enough time, you make a chazaka, it becomes yours. The difference between a kinyan that's made out of kibush versus a kinyan made out of chazaka is that if I conquer a land, being that I acquired it only because I conquered it, so if then someone is going to conquer it from me, so the same tool that I used is being used against me. So I made it holy when I conquered it, and now that the non-Jews conquered it from the Jewish people, they took away that holiness. Masha'inkin, when it comes to king and chazaka means that it becomes yours because you settle in it. The Goyim never settled in the land of Israel. And it's important to know that, historically, that all they did was they exiled us. The land of Israel was desolate during the entire Golus. And therefore, the Kedusha never left. Why would it leave? No one else made a chazaka in the land. Anyways, coming back over here. And why didn't they reconquer it? Because v'hinichum,
the other lands outside of Israel were conquered by other nations, and therefore you had no chazaka, only the king.
No. I'm saying that Nebuchadnezzar, when he entered Israel, the way he exiled us was by conquering the land of Israel. When the Romans came into Israel, what they did was they just exiled us. It wasn't about conquering it, it was about just taking us out of from there. Either way, it was never reset. There was no chazaka by any other people in the land of Israel. That's the reason why the Kedusha remained. But then let's go back over here. And the reason why they didn't reconquer all of the lands was because if they would have reconquered all of the lands, then even Ammon and Moav and the other cities would become holy again. The prohibition of working on Shemitah would come back again. And when having Shemitah in all of those lands as well makes it even more challenging for poor people to survive on the Shemitah year. See, when you have lands adjacent to Israel upon which there is no prohibition of Shemitah, people can work there, so poor people can get a job there. And even if they won't get a job there, the Jews there will have to give tithing, so there'll be more tithings for the poor, which was why the Chachamim were masaken to give Ma'aser Ani on the Shemitah year, because the whole thing was about having more food for poor people. And v'hinichum kadesh yismuch aleim aniyim b'shviis, period. And that's why you give Ma'aser Ani. And the third law was umekablim geirim min hakardoim and min hatarmoidim, that you accept converts. Again, even though this Gemara is of the opinion that if a non-Jew has a relation with a Jewish woman, the child is a mamzer. But he was of the opinion, Chagai was saying, Rabbi Doisa was saying, that the people who live in those cities are not descendants from Goyim and Jewish women. Had that been the case, they would have been Mamzerim, Jewish Mamzerim, but that was not the case. They're just Goyim. and therefore accept converts. In fact, we learned that that you cannot accept converts. This Tana is of the opinion that Ovid Kichavim, that had a relation with a Bas Yisrael, right? Vlad Mamzer. Ravashi says, don't confuse Rami and Chagai. Don't forget, Rami cannot argue with Chagai. Chagai was a Navi. So it's not a contradiction, because Kartuyim Itmar, that when did Rami say that you can't accept converts? He was saying that you can't accept converts from the nation called the Kartuyim, not the Karduyim. From the tough, no. From the Dalad, yes. Kedamri Inchi, Kartuyim are Pesulim. That the people who live in Kartuyim, they don't even know they're Jewish. But many of them are descendants from a union of a goy and a Jewish woman. And again, these are the Tanoim that are of the opinion those descendants are Jewish. We also hold that they're Jewish. We don't consider them Mamzerim. By the way, continuing from yesterday, we do paskin that if a non-Jew had a relation with a Jewish woman, the child is a pagum or a paguma, which means that if it's a girl, lechatchila, she's not allowed to marry a kohen. If she married a kohen, if the father was a goy, you don't make them divorce. But if they're not married yet, you don't allow them to get married. So there is a certain pegam. But these Tanoim held, it's not just a pegam, they're mamish mamzerim.
It's a lav?
No, it's not a lav. It's lechatchila not to do it.
The issue about letting them convert is that
they're really Jewish.
they're Jewish.
Yeah, they don't know it. So on the one,
They're Jewish with Mamzerim.
that's right.
So you converting them, you're not doing anything.
Let's go on.
Bringing in Mamzerim.
Ve'ikadam, the other people say, Tani Rami Bar Yecheskel, that Rami Bar Yecheskel learned in Abraisa that Ein Mekam Gerim and Kartuyim. And is it not Kartuyim and Karduyim the same? In other words, is Rami finding a Tana that argues with Chagai? So Amar Ravashi, the same answer. Loi, Kartuyei Lechud ve'Karduyei Lechud. Kedamre Inchi, Kartuyei Psili, period. Continues the Gemara. You should know that Rabbi Yochanan argues with Chagai. Again, Rabbi Yochanan is an Amayra. If he argues with Chagai, that's because he found the Tana who's substantiating his opinion, unlike Chagai's. And the Amayra called Sabia, the Amri Tarvayu, they both hold that Ein Mekablin Gedim in Hartarmoidim, that you're not allowed to accept converts from Tarmoidim. They are descendants from unions between Goyim and Jewish women, and they all held, as we'll see in a moment, that the kids are Mam Zaydim. Fact the Gemara. And more than that, so 1 second, Tosfos says in Amud Beis that, again, Rabbi Yochanan had a tradition that Chagai never said that you could receive converts. Well, the reason why he argued with it is because he knew that Chagai never said it. How can you say Rabbi Yochanan holds that you can't receive converts from Talmudim, from the Talmudim? Vatanan, we learned the following in a Mishnah. Now to understand the next Mishnah, a couple of words of introduction. Introduction number 1. The menstrual blood, dam nida, the blood itself is tamei midoiraisa. Blood that is not part of the woman's vest, if a woman stains, it's not a period blood, and it dried, it's on a garment, we're going to call that stained garment a kesem, a stain on a garment, that is tamei midrabanan. Now, midoiraisa, tamei midrabanan. Dama yotze megufa, it's an av. Yeah, so the dam becomes an av. We learned that a few times already. So the blood is there, even though it's dry. Now, the rabbis decreed that doesn't make a difference. That's an av. No, the blood is an av. The kesem is an av. Now, the rabbi said that blood from a goya is also tamei, midrabanan, but it's only tamei if it's still wet. Therefore, if a person finds a stained garment, is that tamei or not tamei? If it's coming from a city where the majority of people there are Jewish people, so there's a logic to say that this kesem is a Jewish kesem, so the garment is tamei, midrabanan. Midrabanan. Why I'm saying midrabanan? Because midoiraisa, even from a Jewish woman, when is dam tamei? Only if it's dam nida, not a kesem. And if a woman stam spotted. But if it's from a non-Jewish woman, there even midrabanan it's not tamei. Another thing to remember, that Jewish people, because they knew that the Chachamim were Mesaken, that Ksamim is Tamei, they were very careful to put away their Ksamim. So sometimes, even if there were Jewish people there as well, it's not just majority or minority, you have to have a big majority to say that the Kesem is Tamei, because if it's 50-50, let's say, we're not going to say, it might have come from a Jewish woman. We say, no, it did not come from a Jewish woman because they put away their Ksam. So the question is, if you find the Kesem in the city called the Rekem, says the Tanakam, it's Tahar, because it comes from Goyish woman. Rabbi Yehuda Metame. Why is Rabbi Yehuda Metame? Mipnei, because really the people that live in Rekem, they think they're not Jewish, but they're Jewish. Mipnei Shem Gedim, and he says the following: there was a time that people from Rekem converted, and then V'toyim. V'toyim means that they became non-believers. They went off the way. And the real halacha is that a convert who stops keeping the mitzvahs stays Jewish, like any other Jew. He becomes a Jew that doesn't keep the dinim. But the dinim that apply to the Jewish people will apply to them.
And their children too.
And their children too, if they marry each other. Those people married everyone from the same village. It wasn't a global world. However, Rabbi Yehuda is Maida that if you find the Kesem mibein oived kichavim, that if you find it from another city where Goyim really lived there, then takator. Now the Gemara says v'havin and ba. We need to understand, turning the page, that kopasik v'tani. We found a brayso that states categorically that mibein ha'oivd kichavim, that if you find the Kesem from amongst the Gentiles, it is tar v'afilu min tarmoid. And even from the city of Talmud. In other words, the people in Talmud are called Goyim. And Rabbi Yochanan says, so Rabbi Yochanan is contradicting himself. Before we learned in Amud Aleph that Rabbi Yochanan says, Ein mekabelin gedim. Because they are descendants from unions between Goyim and Jewish women. And according to what we're learning now, they are considered mamzedim. But here Rabbi Yochanan is saying that even from Talmud, people that live there are full-fledged non-Jews. And if you're going to say that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of this Mishnah, true, this Mishnah is telling you that even Rabbi Yehuda is saying that only Rekem are Jews, but Talmud are Goyim. That's what the Stam Mishnah is saying, but Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold with it. It can be. Because Rabbi Yochanan says, Halachic is Stam Mishnah. Whenever a Mishnah says a rule without giving an author, without giving a name, the Halacha is like that Mishnah. So Rabbi Yochanan should have paskined like this Mishnah that Talmud people are considered Goyim. So the Gemara answers, Amoiroi Ninu Valibid Rabbi Yochanan. There's an argument between Amoiroi if Rabbi Yochanan ever said that Stam Halachic is Stam Mishnah. The ones who held that Rabbi Yochanan said Halachic is Stam Mishnah couldn't have said that Rabbi Yochanan says Ein mekamlin geilim min Talmud, because this Stam Mishnah says that Talmudim are Goyim, from whom you can take converts. The version that held, the Amoida that held that Rabbi Yochanan said that you can't receive Gedim from Talmud, never held that Rabbi Yochanan needs to paskin like a Stam Mishnah. Says the Gemara, why Taki can you not be Mekabel Gedim from the city of Talmud? So Pligeba Rabbi Yochanan v'Sabia. There's an argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Sabia. Chad Amar Mishum Avdei Shloimei. Some of them, one of them will hold, and like Rashi explains, that even the servants of Shlomo HaMelech were very wealthy. And unfortunately, sometimes women marry men because they're very wealthy. So they got Jewish women to marry them. Again, we are of the opinion that if a guy has a relation with a Jewish woman, their offsprings are mamzedim. And they moved to the city of Talmud. So the whole city, the whole village of Talmud was established by Jewish mamzedim. And they kept on remarrying into each other. So even though we went ahead hundreds of years from King Shlomo, the halacha was don't accept converts from them. The Chadam, another one, says that the reason why they were considered mamzedim wasn't because of Avdei Shlomo, was because B'nai Yerushalayim, something that happened during the Churban Bayis Rishon. And the Gemara will explain in a moment exactly what happened to the daughters of Yerushalayim. So B'Shlomo Lamanda Omer Mishum Avdei Shlomo. The one who holds that the problem with the Talmudim is that they are descendants from the slaves of King Solomon, from the non-Jewish slaves of Shlomo HaMelech. Kosovar, this will be the opinion that Oived Kechavim the Eved, that if a goy or even an Eved, it means even an Eved who went into the mikveh and took upon himself to keep the mitzvahs, and who is a semi-Jew who has to keep all of the negative commandments, and even some of the positive commandments, generally like women. Nevertheless, if they have al-Bas Yisrael, if they have a relation with a Jewish woman, and they have a child, Havlad Mamzer. What is the meaning of they are descendants from the daughters of Yerushalayim? So and here itself, there's an argument between Rabbi Yosef and the Chachamim. And both of them said their opinion, quoting Rabba Bar Bar Chana. Chad Omar, one of them said that Tereisar, Alfei, Gavra, that there were 12,000 foot soldiers. And Veshita Alfei Kashtoye, and there were 6,000 archers that entered Yerushalayim during the times of Churban Bayis Rishon. So either there was a total of 18,000 soldiers, 12 and 6, or there was a total of 12. V'chad Omar Treisei Alfei Gavri, Uminayu, and from the 12, half of them were Shita Alfei Kashtoye, 6,000 of them were archers. And what about them? That Bishah Shenichnasu Evtikachavim Leichel. That during Churban Bayis Rishon, when they went into the Beis Hamikdash, Hakoil Nifnu Al Kesel V'Azov. Everyone, all of the soldiers, were looking to loot the gold and the silver. But these 12 or 18,000 soldiers, Nifnu Al Bnei Yerushalayim. They went looking for the daughters of Yerushalayim. And this is the meaning of the pasuk in Eicha, that Nashim B'Tziois Inu, that they violated all of the women in Sion. And they ravaged the Psulais, the virgins that lived in the city of Yehuda. In other words, that there was a terrible calamity that happened there. And those descendants moved to the city of Tarmoid. And again, according to this, Havlad is Mamzer. I want you to know that this is actually a machlekes of Tanoim. Rabbi Kiva holds Havlad Mamzer. Rabbi Shmuel holds that the Vlad is kosher. And we paskin like Rabbi Shmuel. Let's go on. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonasan. Being that we started off the sugya quoting Rabbi Doisa, telling the Chachamim when he heard that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, so he said, "Nara yisi v'gam zakanti." So now the Gemara quotes Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani that says that this verse was said by whom? So he says, it was said by God, nor was it said by King David. Why not? We'll see in a moment. It was said by Sar Ha'olam Amru. So Rashi uses the word Sar Ha'olam Malach. We have a very interesting Tosfos that speaks about Sar Ha'olam, saying that Sar Ha'olam is the angel we call Malach Matat. We learn about him a lot in Chassidus. He's Malchus, I think, of the world of Yetzirah. Now, even though we know all these things are godliness, so are Malachim. Nevertheless, the words of Rashi is that this is an angel. The Gemara calls him the master of the world. The master of the world means that everything that happens by Hashgacha Pratis. So the Hashgacha Pratis goes through this master. That's why he's called the master of the world. Everything that happens in the world goes through, the channels through Malach Matatrin. That this Malach Matatrin was around since the creation of the world. So he was the one that said that Nar Yisi, that I used to be young. Vegam Zakanti, and now I got older. And I never saw a tzaddik that was abandoned. I never saw a tzaddik that was abandoned. So why was it said by Sar Ha'olam? Because Rabbi Yonasan says, Man Amri, who else could have said it? Did God say it? How can Hashem say, Nar Ha'isi, Vegam Zakanti? The level of Kutchabrichu, the level of godliness called Kutchabrichu, is above time. If you are above time, you're never young and you never get old. Mi ika zikna kamei. Is there any getting old? Forgot to say I was young and now I'm old. Elo, you would say, what do you mean? King David said it. It's in Tehillim. David HaMelech wasn't that old. In other words, when a person is very old and they never saw a tzaddik being in a bad position. True that tzaddik v'raloi, but in the long run, when you live enough time, you're never completely abandoned. Stakera, but not abandoned. So he says, if a person is old and he says, I lived in a long life and I never saw a tzaddik abandoned. Wow. But if you were young to begin with, David HaMelech only lived 70 years.
But how is Zikna Shayach Malach?
Oh, 1 second. Umi kashish kulahai. I want to answer that question. Eloshmamino sarha oilam amru. So Rani is asking, how do you say old by a malach? The answer is just to know the words in Kabbalah. That kutchabrichu is the level of godliness which is for sure above the 7 emotions. Shechina is the level of godliness that is from the 7 emotions and specifically from Malchus. Malach Matatra, and we learn in Chassidus, comes from Malchus. Time begins by Bina. Chachma and Bina is the past and the future. And therefore anything that comes higher than Chachma Bina cannot be called old. It's not young nor old, it's Lamayla Mahazman. All of the godliness that comes from the lower spheres are bound by time. If they're bound by time, if they're in the restraints of time, you can say young and old. And he has been around since the beginning of the world. Now that we quoted the statement from Shmuel bar Nachmani, so we continue. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonasan. My dechsiv, what's the meaning of the pasuk, going back to Eicha, that Yodai Paras Sor Al Kol Machmodel, that his hand was spread out on all of the treasures of Yerushalayim. What does that refer to? That refers to Aman Umayev, that the Shah Shenichnasu Evdikachavim Lahechel, when they entered the Hechel. Hakoil Nifnu Al Kesev Azov, they were all looking to rob gold and silver. Veheim, but the Ammonites and the Moavites, who were always insulted by the fact that Hashem does not allow us to take converts from their nation, so they wanted to take revenge. And unfortunately, throughout our history, when the Goyim want to take revenge against the Jews, they feel that their medium, their way is to burn our books. So Ammon and Moav went into the Heichel, and Nifnu al Sefer Torah, and they found the Sefer Torah. There was a Sefer Torah in the Heichel. The Sefer Torah in the Heichel were very special. We know that we had a Sefer Torah in the Heichel that was overlooked by Ezra the scribe. So they found such an old Sefer Torah. Amru, and they said, this is where it's written, that the Jewish people are not allowed to accept converts from the nations of Ammon and Moav. So Yisrael ba'esh, so they burned the Sefer Torah in fire. Then it says, Vayter tziv Hashem liYaakov, seviv of tzarav, that Hashem commanded regarding Jacob, regarding the Jewish people, that we should be surrounded by the people who are our adversaries. What does that mean? It means, ironically, the nations that surrounded us while we lived in Israel, the nations that were our adversaries, even when we went into Golus, we were still stuck with those adversaries. Or you can say that whenever Jewish people are in Golus, who surrounds the Jewish people? Who comes from Crown Heights? Amar Rav, says Rav, Kigoin, Hoimanya, Lefum Nara. Like, for example, that the Haimanya, Rashi says that they were Greeks. Really, people say that it's a mistake in Rashi, that Haimiyah are the same Amoinim. That these Amoinim, when the Jewish people went into Golus, when they went to Babylonia, to a place called Lefum Nahara, when they lived there, who neighbored them? Vayter, the Ammonites. That means that our enemies always end up living around the Jewish people. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Ravasi. Says Rabbi Ravasi, now another opinion. Oivet kechavim shekiddush b'zmanazeh chosheshin l'kedushin. Says the Gemara, a new concept. Look at this. What happens if a Jewish man has a relation with a non-Jewish woman? What are we pasking today? The child is not Jewish. Yeah, that's also up to a debate. Here we're going to be learning an opinion that if a Jew had a relation with a non-Jewish woman and had an offspring, God forbid, the child is a Jewish mamzer. And therefore...
why the Lashon Kiddush?
1 second. If they are Jewish, then they have the power to affect Kiddushin. But their descendants will be mamzerim. Because when one of the parents are either a mamzer or a mamzeres, the vlad goes after the pogum. Whenever two people of different genealogy get married and one has a blemish, whether it is the father or the mother, the blemish always goes to the next generation. The irony of life. I had a great teacher that said that he hoped that his children would get his brain and his wife's nose. He used to say that they got my nose, and that was just a joke. But the pagam goes on. The blemish keeps on going on. And if we would hold, we don't paskin that way, that if the father is Jewish and the mother is not, the kid is a Jewish mamzer. So since we're going to go into the whole exiling of the 10 tribes, so if someone comes from the areas where the 10 tribes were exiled to, you have to be afraid that whoever is living there is already Jewish, but a mamzer. And therefore, if they gave Kedushin to a Jewish woman, you can't say a goy gave Kedushin. A Kedushin is not chal from a goy, but they're not goyim, they're Jews. On the other hand, oy gewalt, it's a Jewish, but it's a Jewish mamzer.
So a mamzer can also make that.
Of sure, it's even a love. You should not marry, you should not enter Kal Yisrael. But the Kedushin is chal, it's a lav she'en by Kaddish. Kedushin teifsin. Says the Gemara, b'chol the parish menu b'parish. Why are you telling me that you are afraid that if a non-Jew gives Kedushin to a Jewish woman, the Kedushin is Kedushin because maybe he's a descendant of the 10 tribes. Most people are not descendants of the 10 tribes. So the Gemara answers, Beduchta de Kivi. I'm speaking about Goyim, really Jewish mamzedim, that are from the places where we know the 10 tribes went there. And therefore, when you are in the place of the doubt, right? Kol kavod mertzal mertzah, Amar Rav Abba, Amar Rav Kahana. Now let's go find out where did the 10 tribes go into exile, which would mean wherever the 10 tribes went into exile, the goyim living there today are Jewish mamzedim, according to this opinion.
According to Ravasi.
According to Ravasi, and according to
the way we passed it, they would just be Jews.
No, they would be goyim. Because the Jewish men married non-Jewish women. The Jewish tribes married into the Goyish population, unfortunately, from the Seres HaShvat. So, and where are the places?
If the mothers are not Jewish, then what's even the Hamid to say?
So you're not copying what we're saying. So good for the web audience, guys. We're learning today two big chidushim. The second chidush, no, listen, the Gemara is telling you here that a Jewish man that has a relation with a non-Jewish woman, this Gemara holds the child is a Jewish mamzer. It's not the halach. We learned another din that if a Jewish woman in the Amud Aleph had a relation with a non-Jewish man,
betrothed a Jewess, meaning the man was not Jewish, the woman was Jewish.
Being that the descendants there are descendants from the 10 tribes Jews who married Goyim, which their children are Jewish, mamzedim, but they're Jewish. So if such a descendant gives Kedushin to a kosher Jewish woman, Kedushin is Kedushin. Because they're not Goyim, even though the mothers were Goyim, but they're Jews. The Kedushin is Taifsin, but you should know that they are Mamzedim. Let's keep on going. It'll happen in a second. And now we have to find out where are those locations. So the Gemara is quoting a pasuk to find out where they are. And you have some interesting information. So it says Vayanchem, that where did Sanchedev put the 10 tribes? In a place called Bachlach, in another place called Bechavoir, in a third place called Nahar Goizon, in a fourth place called Orei Madai. These are the 4 locations, and the Gemara tells you where they are. Where is Chalach? Chalach is Chalozin. Chalozin is a river. Chavoir, turning to Daf Yud Zayin, where's Chavoir? Chadayov. Chadayov is northern Iraq today. And the people that live there are descendants from the 10 tribes, and according to our Gemara, they are Jewish Mamzedim. Nahar Goizon is a place called Ginzak. Ginzak is northeastern Syria. Orei Madai is Hamadan. Hamadan might be Jewish Mamzedim. We apologize to the whole Persian community. That the Orei Madai is Nihar. Nihar is not Hamadan, but Nihar is South Hamadan. The Chavrei in the surrounding areas. Chavrei Man, where are the surrounding areas? So Amar Shmuel, it's a place called Kerech, a place called Mushchei, a place called Chitkei, and a place called Dumakya. In other words, Amar Rabbi Yechanan ve'kulam lipsul. Rabbi Yechanan also agrees with Ravasi.
Can't marry Persians.
Doesn't say that. First of all, we don't paskin that way. But I would say it's like this, is that with all of the tumult in the world today, Mamzedim have a terrible inner something cooking in them, and they act out because of that terribly. So the Gemara many times says that the chotzev kulahai shmam, mamzerhu, people that have a lot of chutzpah, they are offspring from a non-kosher union. So they are the product of something unhealthy. So all of those people that live today over there might be Jewish mamzedim. Imagine. And therefore, if they give kedushin, it's very sad. The kedushin might be kedushin. We'll stop over here. At the end of the day, we're learning Gemara. We don't paskin like most things we're learning here, but it's very good to know this. It's very good to know everything. It's good to know that there are opinions that hold that if a goy, but there are opinions that hold that the Jewish mamzeidim. There are opinions here that we learned today that if a non-Jew had a relation with a Jewish woman, the child is a mamzer. Let's stop the video.